Matthew Phelps, co-author of the Turning to God's Word Bible study, You Shall Have No Other Gods, the book of Exodus. Today we'll be talking about lesson 27 of our study, which covers the book of Exodus, chapter 37, verse 10, through chapter 38, verse 31. We are here very much winding down the book of Exodus. Most of the really important thematic concepts we've kind of tied a nice neat bow on. We're done with the narrative in terms of the events that are going to happen. And we're finishing out the execution of the construction of these items, which, if you remember where we are still at the base of the mountain getting ready to leave, and we have to have these things before we leave so that God can come with us, which Moses has talked God into doing. So these things are the things that have to be done so that God will travel with his people in space. There is, in this, a call for broader reflection about how God travels with us, which is the thing I'm going to focus on here, because otherwise, this is very repetitive, right? We've already talked about they're going to build this way, and then we don't need to see, and they built it the same way we described earlier. There's not a lot of really any new content for reflection in terms of the details of this. So we're going to try to pull out some things that we didn't talk about the other time, right? Because the other time it was, well, what does this mean that this is that way and that way? But now that we're doing it so that God can travel with people, I want to look at, why and how does that work today? And this goes through, I would say, a threefold iteration beyond this, right? So you have the tabernacle and you have the ark. And that is back then how God wanted to travel with his people. This also becomes the blueprint that is modified to create the temple. It's the dimensions are reminiscent of this, but altered some, and the structure likewise. The temple is modeled after this, but it loses a key feature. The key feature of this isn't all the dimensions, right? It's what it's called. It's a tabernacle. It's a tent. It can move. It wasn't necessarily a great thing for the history of the people that this became stationary, right? You take God who's going with you wherever you go, and you say, cool, I'm going to put him here, and then I'll go there. But he can stay, right? This is a thing we do. And this is a great topic for reflection, is where do we say, when you're carving out space to make things holy, you don't want to do that in a way where you're God over there. The part that we carve out and separate shouldn't be the part where God is, right? The things you're removing and creating distance between yourself and those things when you're creating these sacred spaces in your life, God has to be on the inside and not on the outside, right? What happens to the people when they plant this in the temple form is they put God on the outside, and they stay removed from where God is. Whereas God was meant to be on the inside in the camp, and where they go all the time. And everything else gets separated farther out of the camp, so it's away from where God is. And God's traveling right there with you. We do that, right? I do that. I won't speak for all of you, but it's so easy, even if you're carving out a little bit of space for God, to have that be the outside space, right? The stationary fixed area that is peripheral to where most of your life An example I like to think of is when you decide to say prayers every day, but you're going to do it laying in bed before you fall asleep. And that's going to be how you end your day, right? So great, you've carved out the space, better than nothing. But what you've done is you've put that space in the outside, right? You have your whole life that you're living for you, and then here's this carved out thing on the outside. We do it in so many ways where I have me and then I have my faith, and it matters, but I'm going to leave it kind of outside of my routine and normal life, and it's going to be an add-on thing instead of a core thing at the heart of it. So that is our first phase here with the temple. The second kind of manifestation of this then is from this idea of temple, we build churches, right? So there was this one stationary, removed area where the people put God, and then there wasn't even that anymore when the temple was destroyed. Our churches are also modeled after this idea of the temple, but it's a different thing because we don't have to have just one, right? Thanks to what Jesus did, God can be present in all of these churches. So it's a lot less of a single stationary place. And it's a lot more of something that's with us wherever we are, but it still becomes like the root and the heart of a community, but you can have a lot of them, which changes it quite a bit. And that sets a lot of the tone for Christian worship, right? Catholic worship, as we have these places we can go that are now set apart, but that are meant to be the heart and the root of our Christian life. And if you're traveling, you can go to another one and it's there, and like it's replicable, right? The important part, maybe your church is one of those ugly ones made in the 70s. It looks like it's all around a big table, or maybe it's something that was made 200 years ago out of marble and glorious, beautiful construction. And the thing that's most important about both of those churches, that Jesus is there, is the same. So building quality can help with worship, but the thing that makes it what it is the same in both cases, right? God's physical presence in those churches. But then, of course, the last level of this is God never wanted to just be stationary, right? The idea was this idea of tabernacle, of him traveling with us. The real fulfillment of this idea, and the most profound one, is when we ourselves become the temple, right? And God travels with us. In that regard, we're not doing in the imagery, there's a separation when the people are originally traveling, right? And God's traveling with them. Because they were so disobedient to the covenant right away, there was this idea of, I'm going to travel with you and I'll be sort of in your midst, but I've got to keep a little bit of distance or I'm going to kill you all because you're awful. And so that original form, there was still that separation and God was still a bit on the outside, right? Way less so than when you just plant him in Jerusalem and then you go to not Jerusalem. But he was still traveling on the outside of where the people were. The idea, though, was he's right there traveling with his people, right? And Jesus gives us not only his presence in our churches, in our tabernacles, but we become the tabernacle, right? In fact, the Gospel according to John describes the incarnation as the Word became flesh and pitched his tent in us, in or among, but you can very validly translate that as in, right? Where we ourselves become the tent that holds God, and wherever we go, that's where God is traveling, because we are this container, right? there's no more separation anymore, right? We're on the inside instead of it being on the outside. That's what Jesus did, is we become now the tent, the tabernacle of God. So as we're looking at the finishing, the construction of these things, the other main item for our personal reflection is, if I'm building a place for God to live, I'm not using acacia wood and gold and linen. I'm using my life and my soul, right? And if this many chapters and this much attention can be placed on, it's got to be this many cubits and it's got to be this material, and only this guy is qualified to do this. If that much care is put into things, how much more should be put into me, right? What do I need to do to make my soul, my life, a thing that is inviting to the presence of God, and to keep him from being on the outside and to invite him into the inside, and to travel with me everywhere that I go. And I think too often we get very comfortable with the inverse of that, right? With this old idea of God's, the space I'm going to carve out leaves God neatly on the outside. And I go about my life and then I come back to where God is when it's convenient for me. Instead of, when we're drawing those lines, when we're creating that space and that holiness, it's really important that God stay on the inside with us and not on the outside. Because the same process of building in those lines in that space can leave God on the outside rather than on the inside with any of these things that we do. And that's clearly not the point, right? Even if, to use an example that's come up so much in this book, the idea of the Sabbath, right? You can go to church on Sunday and you can have your Sabbath. And if you're still doing that, and then you're, watching football all day or going about your normal business for the rest of the day, great, you have a line, right? You've created space, you have a line, you're doing some of the work of holiness. That is a good thing, and it is progress. But if 80% of your day is not that mass, then what you're doing is you have the line, and you're on one side of the line, and God's on the other side of the line, right? And you've successfully built some of those structures, but you've done it in a way that actually creates distance between you and God instead of closeness between you and God. So just be mindful as we are engaged in the work of holiness that we end up on the same side of these barriers that we're creating as God is, and not on the other one. And that's the other thing I think is worth reflecting on here. Here we continue to build the various implements needed to carry out liturgy, right? All of this, again, is about the presence of God and how we enable the presence of God among these people, right? God does not pack light. He needs a lot of stuff around and with him, right? So you have like the central holy of holy areas. You've got the tabernacle. The closer to where God is, the more valuable the stuff is. You need like tools and implements around to support and to reinforce the presence of God. And you need a place to put those. Even like the place to put the stuff that you're going to use for God has to be made out of gold, right? And because it's getting close to where God is. Note, again, the holiness and itself is just a separation, but there's an increase in value as things get closer to God, right? We equate often holiness equals closeness to God. That's, as we've talked about a lot, that's not true, right? Holiness just creates the space for the meeting of God. The presence of God does something else, right? It elevates and magnifies the things in it, right? So that you can't just put your junk in the presence of God. That again, so should we be, right? If we're seeking to invite God into our hearts, we need to make that pure and malleable, but God's presence there will also elevate us, right? And that's again a part of why we want that holiness, is the closer to the presence of God you are, the more. We're so used to using the word holy for this. I'm struggling to even find the words for it, right? It's not the holier you are, it's the purer, the more loving, the more like God you are, the closer you get into that space. The holiness just creates the space that allows you to get closer and closer to God, which makes you more and more like God, which is symbolized by these things getting more valuable the closer they get. But God doesn't care about things being gold, right? But we become more precious as people the closer we can get into that space to God, so that even things that should be throwaway, a table or a closet to hold stuff that's not being used because it's close to God, is gold. So too are we, right? The better we carve out and utilize space to grow closer to God, the more precious we become. They didn't have electric lights. Enclosed tent where God is, you need, this is more of the idea of you need light in there. So there's a functional, there's a practical thing, but you can't just like carry in any old lantern because of its proximity to God. So this also has to be special. So it's made out of gold, and it's very deliberately of a sevenfold light, right? The idea being like lampstand straight up, and then 3 branches coming off of each side. 3 + 1 + 3, 7. There are 7. We talked about this when it came up before, but 7 is in the Old Testament very much a number pointing toward needing further fulfillment, which in this case, so this is the thing that also, it's in and signifies in its own right, that light in the presence of God. God himself becomes like the 8th light, right? The one that we're looking forward to, right? I am the light of the world. Where this idea of God illuminating the world and himself is fulfilled in Jesus Christ, but practically, like, you need to be able to see when you're serving in the temple, and they need light to do that. And following the form, you can't use just anything. And here's the altar of incense. We know this is not strictly true, right? But there's this ancient idea of God likes nice smelling things, right? And the smells go up to heaven, right? So if you take, what you want is, you have a prayer or a request for God who's up. You want to send that up to God, and he's going to be better disposed to hear that if it smells like delicious barbecue or like incense or something good smelling, right? Wafting up with your prayer. So there's this idea of that then gets reinforced with the idea of, well, if what you're trying to do is offer nice smelling things up to God, then where God is should also smell nice, right? And so especially when you're like not too far away murdering animals, and that probably comes with some smells, in this place where God is, you're going to want to make sure it smells good, right? It's just another way of, again, God does not travel light, right? You need your special lamps, you need your special oils, you need all your tools, you need your incense, you need special clothes for you so that you can be seen in his presence, right? God is a very demanding person to travel with, and very specific and particular. But he's also someone you really want to be traveling with. And so it's worth hauling his luggage around, even though there's a lot of it. It matters that there's all this stuff, right? Like, as we talked about, all of this creates this sacredness, this set apartness to, if there's the movie, Indiana Jones and the one with the Grail, right? The third one, I think. There's this idea about, well, what was the cup that Jesus drank out of in the Last Supper, right? And they have all these cups, and like they're trying to find the Holy Grail, and they're given a chance to, grab one and try to drink from it. And if you're right, then it's like life eternal, and if you're wrong, like it'll kill you. And there's this idea of, well, what would this cup look like, right? And like, the Nazi guy picks like the most ornate fancy cup he can find and dies, and then Andy picks like this boring wooden cup, and it's the Grail, and it's fine, which is an interesting thing to think about. Jesus would have probably used an ordinary cup for the Last Supper because he himself made it holy, but the other idea was not so wrong. Right? If you look back to everything we know about God in the Old Testament, like if something was going to be that significant, it would be the most ornate thing, right? It's such an interesting idea that you're supposed to watch that and think, oh, of course the ordinary one was fine, but like everything leading up to Jesus would have suggested that the Nazi was right. And then something changes, huh? Like, because we stop in Christ, it shifts away from being God in a tent, right? And traveling with all of his stuff, and toward us being the tent, and God traveling in us. So the thing now that has to be bejeweled and gold and ornate is me, and not my cup. Like, Jesus made everything he touched. I'm reluctant to use the word holy because it just I mean the thing more than set apart, right? Precious. Like, it's the opposite, right? Here in the Old Testament, we're making the things precious so that they can be in the presence of God, so that they signify or signal what the thing is. But with Jesus, the opposite happens, right? By being in contact with Jesus, the things become precious, whatever they're made of, right? Like, it doesn't have to be a gold thing. Jesus used it, right? This was the cup he used for the Last Supper. This is precious, even if it's made out of wood, because Jesus. And that's the shift between Old Testament and New Testament, is you're trying to build up God by the things you use for worship in the Old Testament, and you're trying to elevate the perception of God. In the New Testament, you have God, so he just elevates everything, even if it's plain. It ceases to be plain because it is used in the service of God. So the symbolism is, like, in a way becomes irrelevant when faced with the profound reality of the presence of God. Because I was talking about cups specifically, it's worth noting, like, there are, like, the cups used and the vessels used for the Eucharist are still, like, we don't use ordinary, like, we don't go into the priest's, like, kitchen cabinets and grab, like, a cup and a plate and use that to celebrate the Mass, right? In part because, could Jesus do that at the Last Supper? Oh, absolutely. Because again, he's Jesus. If you're a priest trying to imitate that in a way that God makes it more than an imitation and like puts his stamp down on top and like makes that an echo of the Last Supper, you're still not God to make the thing holy by your own and precious by your own action, right? So you're not, because you're trying to be a repetition of the thing that Jesus can make it precious by himself. But you're saying, Jesus, I want you to come here into this bread and wine. So we're still going to imitate some of what was done when we wanted God to come down into the tabernacle, right? So you're still going to use precious materials in our liturgy because our liturgy is closer to what they did in the Old Testament when they wanted God to enter the ark than it is to Jesus at the Last Supper, because Jesus was God. God was already wherever Jesus was. Jesus wasn't inviting God to come to the Last Supper. He was there, right? So the things he uses are precious because he's God. Our priests might stand in the person of Christ, but they are not Christ. And so we still echo the old practice as well. So all of that contrast, it just makes a fascinating point about what makes things precious, right? And gives that value. It's the presence of and the proximity to God that creates that preciousness. So if you're God, you can use any cup and you're great. If you're not God, you should be adorning things that you're trying to invite the presence of God into, which can be a cup and it certainly can be your soul. Even here, the consumables are precious, right? So lampstand, table, implements, great. We make those out of gold. It's a big deal because we're going to be using the same ones for a long, long time. But this isn't like buying a really fancy soap dispenser and filling it with dollar store soap, right? Okay, it looks nice, but then we don't care about what goes in it. Like, we're going to cheap out on the consumables, right? We're not doing that. This is the things that we're using in this process, specifically oils and incense, are taken as seriously and are as important as all the other implements. And now we make the altar of sacrifice or of burnt offerings, following a similar formula. To repeat the main point from previously, this is less important than the other stuff. Because our altar comes to resemble in function in a certain way this one, more than the altar of incense, we ascribe, and our altar that symbolically becomes an altar of sacrifice is in the center. We tend to think back and think, oh, this must have been the important part, but it wasn't. The sacrifices were more toward the outside and before you got to the tent, right? Like, it's in the courtyard, but not the tent. It's more like how you enter and less like how you're there. And while that is still true, right? Like, the sacrifice of Christ is how we enter into the body of Christ, and God likewise enters into us. That is still how entry occurs. We still, in our main liturgical act, call to mind and make present via the power of sacramental memory that sacrifice. So it becomes more central to our worship than it was to theirs. It's an interesting point of distinction and one to think about. But let's not change our past perception and think that the altar of sacrifice was the center for them as it is for us, because it wasn't. It was closer to the outside and less precious in terms of metals and things, right? God wasn't present there is the difference, right? When God is the thing that was sacrificed, God is present. He's not in the nice tent. He's on this wooden altar, he's the sacrifice. But the things that are most precious are the things closest to God's presence. So when God's presence is the sacrifice, you have to move where you're doing the sacrifice to where the ark is, because unfathomably, God himself is the sacrifice and not just sitting in the tabernacle at the mercy seat. And so the whole thing kind of collapses in on itself, and outside becomes inside, because God himself is the sacrifice. And that drawing in of the outer things by that sacrifice is also how we get to cross the threshold of the tent. He draws those outer things into the presence of God. In the previous time around, we talked quite a bit about this laver and its comparison to the sea in the temple and then the book of Revelation. I won't repeat all that. It's neat, though. We still have this still is a thing that echoes down and repeats today, right? We come into, you had the laver between where the sacrifices happen and in the tent, and it was for washing, and we still have an echo or a repetition of this. When you come into a Catholic church, you're going to have either little things with holy water on it, or a big font, or some variation, or both, or a glass bowl, or there's still going to be some form and repetition of this as well. The neat and new thing here is where the metal for this comes from. It's made of bronze. There's this idea that they melt down mirrors to get to this, which, if you're used to all mirrors being glass, might not make sense. But they didn't have glass mirrors then, right? They had very polished bronze, and that was the best you could do. And it was decent, but definitely not as good as the glass versions we have now. So if you're confused about where are these mirrors coming in, it's because mirrors were bronze. And so they had these, and these would have been valuable and not insignificant things for these women to be giving up for the making of this container to allow for washing. Again, it is made sacred both by what's given up and by its intention to be present to God, right? It's worth noting, as all of these things are precious, some of their value is derived from the fact that the people are giving up valuables to make this happen, right? So there's the component of it that being close to God is an important thing in its value, but also that those precious items are given up by the people to create this also gives it value, right? It's an interesting meeting between the presence of God and the sacrifice of the people that really opens up the way for the presence of God. Does God care about gold more than bronze or copper or iron or anything else? No. What gives that gold value? It's just because it's valuable, right? It's commercially valuable, and the people are assigning that value to God, right? They're saying God is this important. And we can still do that, right? There's a means of giving to God the things that are first and valuable that sanctifies. And it's not just money, though it can be money. It's just further reinforcing the point of when we're carving out that space to God, are we giving it the things needed to make it precious, right? Is God on the inside or is he on the outside? If I'm putting into that space and into God the things that make it precious, then that's where I'm going to want to be too, right? I am investing in, literally, in the presence of God being with me versus keeping him on the outside. To further reinforce the point, we're creating separation here, right? And to do that, you need, and you've got an outer court as well as an inner tent. And to do that, God doesn't travel light. You've got to haul all the stuff around to be able to set up this whole wall, cloth wall around this whole thing. It is not a small endeavor. Think about also how that would affect travel, right? You're trying to get some good travel days in, but you've got to tear this down and set it back up every time you want to move. That would necessarily affect the pace of travel. So cloth walls and gates, right? This isn't like a chain link fence. This is even the outside part. This is also nice and valuable cloth, and it's not small. The whole thing is maybe half the length, half the size of a football field. You have a lot of people who are going to need to use it, right? This is a big deal, and again, this would impair the efficiency of travel. Not only having to take all the stuff, but having to set it up and tear it down all the time, and being limited by not exactly having like professional grade lighting that you could use. Like you're going to be traveling during daylight hours, and you're also going to be doing this during daylight hours, and you're not going to skip setting this up. Like this will affect, if you're ever wondering how could they spend 40 years traveling in the desert, how far are you going to get by the time you have to tear this down, travel, and have enough daylight left to set it back up? They'd have gotten pretty efficient at it, but that's going to take hours. It's definitely a practical consideration when it comes to logistics. That is one we don't, does it mean it should have taken them 40 years? Definitely not. That's kind of their own doing, and God's, and it was designed and intentional. But if you're thinking, how did these people move so slowly? There is a practical consideration along with it. And it says something really important. Again, like carving out what's needed for God to travel with you means you're not going to travel as efficiently as if you're not doing that. When we're living, prioritizing having God travel right along with us as we go means we won't be traveling the same way that we would otherwise. I think personally, I have a hard time getting used to that sometimes, right? I'm happy to have God travel along with me, but right, like I'm in charge and I'm setting the itinerary, and he can come along if he wants to, but he better not slow me down. And then you get on the road, and that's not how it is at all. And like, we're not going where I'm trying to go and the way I'm trying to go there if God's really traveling with me, right? I'm really going along with him, and I'm just like his driver, right? And he's like the one setting the destination, and I'm essentially a chauffeur. But I like to think of it as, you know, I'm just hopping in the driver's seat and I'm gonna go where I can go. And God, if you want to ride along in the passenger seat, that's great. And, that's where how we like to think about that working. But if we're doing it right, the way it's working is we're driving God around. He's in the back, we're the chauffeur, and he's telling us where to go, when to stop, how to get there. And that's correctly executed, right? When you decide to travel with God, you're giving up autonomy over the journey to God. Or you're not traveling with God because he's going where he's going. And you can go along with him or not. But I think we have in our heads, I certainly have had it, this backwards idea that, yeah, God can come along with me if he wants to. And that's what it means to live a good Christian life, right? God will just come along with me where I'm going. No, it's not me needing to let God travel with me where I'm going and what I'm doing. It's the other way around. And I need to keep my act in line if I want to be even allowed to take God where he wants to go. And it's a big deal just for me to be able to take him there, rather than, yeah, he can ride along, I guess. I've got some errands to run. I hope he's okay going to Hy-Vee or whatever, right? Like, no, we're going where he wants to go. In case you missed it, the text tells us that we're just summarizing the making of all of the stuff. The key here is, again, we name the craftsman. It's a big deal. Like, it is a big enough deal that this was all created by people that the chief people involved in the construction are repeatedly named. And we're just kind of summarizing, yeah, we made all of that stuff, but they did. And then finally, and at last here, there's a totaling of the cost or the value of what went into doing this, which is significant. I guess like any good capital campaign, you're accounting for what you raised and how you used it once you're done. In this case, this is probably in the Bible the first capital campaign. It's certainly the first one I'm thinking about to raise capital to build the tabernacle. Everybody contributed, so here you're giving an accounting of what was done. And for future posterity's sake, there's just a note of, the people took this seriously, and this was, you don't build a church for cheap, even a traveling one. And the same was true from this first model of all churches. This has been an overview of Lesson 27 of the Turning to God's Word Bible Study, You Shall Have No Other Gods, the Book of Exodus. For more information, consult our written study and visit us online at turningtogodsword.com.